Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of James Buchanan, and the focus is elected, greatest trial of his life. The year is 1856, and Buchanan is just back from his stint as minister to Great Britain in the Franklin Pierce administration. It's an election year, he's well aware of that, and for the fourth time, his name would be in the mix as the potential nominee for president from the Democratic Party. He knew the stakes were high going into this because he wrote, "I believe that the next presidential term will be perhaps the most important and responsible of any which has occurred since the origin of the government. And whilst no competent and patriotic man to whom it may be offered should shrink from the responsibility, yet he may well accept it as the greatest trial of his life." Well, Buchanan was one of the leading contenders the Democrats got together in Cincinnati in June of 1856, but he wasn't the only one. Incumbent President Franklin Pierce was in the mix. You also had Stephen Douglas, the senator from Illinois, but Pierce and Douglas were tainted over the last few years with what had happened in Kansas. They were behind the Kansas-Nebraska Act, pushing the idea of popular sovereignty, which created a mad rush into this Kansas territory where competing governments had stood up, militias were formed, violence ensued. It was called Bleeding Kansas, and there were a lot of angst on all sides of this equation that did not fare very well for Pierce or Douglas' candidacy. As for Buchanan, he was out of sight, out of mind. He was off in Europe, completely untainted by the Kansas controversy, so this bode well for his candidacy. Well, in Cincinnati, Buchanan had Senator John Slidell as his lead representative at the convention. Some other senators, James Bayard and Jesse Bright, were also working the floor on his behalf, and it was actually a fairly easy assignment. Buchanan led on all 17 ballots, trying to get to that two-thirds supermajority to get the nomination. Pierce was competitive at the beginning, but he started to fade, and after the 14th ballot, he was monitoring things via the telegraph back in Washington. He could see that the nomination was not in reach for him, so he bowed out. His hope that his votes would go to Douglas. He thought that would continue his policy, and Douglas did pick up a little bit in the 15th ballot, but he also saw there was no way for him to get to the two-thirds threshold. And besides, he was really gunning more to the 1860 election, the next one that comes around, so he bowed out, left the field all alone to James Buchanan, and on the 17th ballot, Buchanan finally had the nomination as the Democratic candidate for president. The delegates had one more task to do, to look for a vice presidential candidate and to balance the ticket. You've got Buchanan from the north. They looked south to Kentucky. John Breckinridge was given the nomination for Vice President of the United States. Well, Buchanan was handed this nomination at his home, Wheatland, in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and he proudly accepted it despite this immense challenge. And he was hopeful. He was optimistic. He said, "Let the members of the family, the American people, the states, let them abstain from intermeddling with the exclusive domestic concerns of each other and cordially unite on the basis of perfect equality among themselves in promoting the great national objects of common interest to all, and the good work will be instantly accomplished." Perhaps wishful thinking on the part of the nominee, James Buchanan. Well, after this, Buchanan was essentially silent during the campaign. He stayed home, he entertained hundreds of people who came to see him, a grand social time, but he gave no political speeches. He basically said, "I support the Democratic platform. That means I support the Compromise of 1850, including the Fugitive Slave Law. I support the Kansas-Nebraska Act. I support popular sovereignty. Nothing else to say because I support the Democratic doctrine." Privately, he was pretty concerned. He wasn't saying this publicly, but he wrote, for example, in one letter, "The Union is in danger, and the people everywhere begin to know it. The black Republicans must be, as they can be with injustice, boldly assailed as disunionists, and this charge must be reiterated again and again." The Republicans were a new political party. They had been forming and now were putting forth a candidate for president for the first time. Under John Fremont was that candidate. And the Republicans were primarily a northern sectional party, but they were picking up a lot of supporters in that area. In principle, they were against the expansion of slavery beyond the boundaries in which it already existed. That's what was animating them. This is what Buchanan saw as a move to disunion if they ever got to power. Well, this turned out to be a three-way race. You had Buchanan from the Democrats, you've got Fremont from the Republicans, and you had former President Millard Fillmore had been nominated by the Know-Nothing Party, but it wasn't a close race. It was a pretty easy time. On November 4th, 1856, more than 4 million votes were cast. First time ever topped that number for the American electorate, and Buchanan won pretty easily. 174 to 114 in the Electoral College over Fremont. Fillmore picked up only one state. He was now president-elect, and he commented on his highest priorities heading into his administration. According to Buchanan, the great object of my administration will be to arrest, if possible, the agitation of the slavery question at the North and to destroy sectional parties. Should a kind providence enable me to succeed in my efforts to restore harmony to the Union, I shall feel that I have not lived in vain. Of course, this was not to be. He had 4 months to prepare for his administration during this interregnum. Cabinet was his focus, and his goal was to avoid the extremists from both North and South as he put together his cabinet. He ended up for Secretary of State with Lewis Cass, a party veteran who had been a previous nominee for the party for president, longtime senator, but he had recently lost his Senate seat, and he didn't want to retire yet, so he was interested in a cabinet spot, and he accepted Secretary of State, which was fine for Buchanan. He figured he would largely be his own Secretary of State anyway, given his foreign policy experience, but Cass could be an ally, use advantage for his relationships with other Democrats in Congress. This could be an opportunity for some success, and Cass joined the cabinet. His principal ally in the cabinet, though, was Howell Cobb, a pro-union Democrat from Georgia. He was given the portfolio at the Treasury Department. Now, Buchanan was not an easy boss. He was a taskmaster. In fact, he would often rebuke his cabinet members right to their face in front of their colleagues when he was not happy. But they were pretty loyal to him. All but one stayed his entire time, right up until his successor was elected in 1860. At that point, during that interregnum, there were mass resignations. We'll cover that in a future episode. Well, Buchanan left Lancaster on March 2nd on a special train routing through Baltimore on his way to Washington, D.C. On the 4th, Inauguration Day, Buchanan joined President Pierce on the carriage ride from the White House to the Capitol, where John Breckinridge was first sworn in as vice president in the chambers of the United States Senate. And then you had on the east portico of the Capitol, Chief Justice Roger Taney swore Buchanan into office. The first picture, the first photograph ever taken of a presidential inauguration took place here in March 4th of 1857. And then, of course, Buchanan offered his remarks. Starting his only term as president, he was 66 years old. He had taken a one-term pledge, so this would be his one-time shot. In his inaugural, he initially talked about his political philosophy. Long experience and observation have convinced me that a strict construction of the powers of the government is the only true, as well as the only safe, theory of the Constitution. Whenever in our past history doubtful powers have been exercised by Congress, these have never failed to produce injurious and unhappy consequences. Buchanan was signaling he would resist any move for him to assume any powers that were not authorized to him in the Constitution. This would apply even when inaction would seem like it would paralyze the government in a difficult time, as would unfold during his presidency. Now, as for bleeding Kansas, he said basically nothing to worry about. This problem's already been solved. Just follow the law. According to Buchanan in his inaugural, the whole territorial question being thus settled upon the principle of popular sovereignty, a principle as ancient as free government itself, everything of a practical nature has been decided. No other question remains for adjustment because all agree that under the Constitution, slavery in the states is beyond the reach of any human power except that of the respective states themselves wherein it exists. Kind of a simplistic, straightforward answer, also naively off base given what was really happening in the country. That country was careening toward national fracture. There was bleeding in Kansas, fights in Congress, extremists in the North and the South that were going further and further apart, and the question at hand was, could a constitutionalist, a strict constructionist, a legalist like James Buchanan effectively calm the nation and preserve the Union? Well, like he predicted, it would be the greatest trial of his life, and it would be one in which he would not succeed. But that's the story for another day. That is James Buchanan, elected greatest trial of his life, from the life of James Buchanan. For more presidential chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.